Good morning, and thank you for being here today. Northumberland County, where we are based, is the traditional territory of the Mississauga, Anishinaabe, and Chippewa nations. We offer our gratitude to the First Peoples for their care for and teachings about our earth and our relationship with it. May we honor those teachings. Today, we are presenting the final speaker and the final event in our series, The Power of Trees. I'll turn it over to Program Committee member Bob Hambley to introduce our speaker.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this, the final presentation of the Power of Trees series. As Betty said, my name is Bob Hambley, and I'm a member of the NLC's Programming Committee. My wife Barb and I worked for 30 years in the design profession, and over that time we saw many changes in the way that people communicate with one another. One area that always interested me is the way that images can convey important and often complex data. During our career, I paid close attention to the growth in popularity and the effectiveness of information graphics, something I really enjoy. And imagine how happy I was several years ago when attending the Design Thinkers Conference in Toronto to hear a speaker lecture on several of my favorite topics. 1, design, 2, information graphics, 3, history, and 4, nature. That speaker is with us today, Manuel Lima. Manuel, among other things, is known for his work in information visualization and visual culture. New Scientist magazine calls him an information guru, and Wired magazine says he is a man who turns data into art. Boy, I wish someone would say that about me. So I'm very happy to introduce you to Manuel Lima.
Thank you so much, Bob, for the very kind introduction. I was looking at the slideshow just before we started, and it seems like this is such an interesting series on trees and everything that relates to trees. So I couldn't be happier to talk about, I guess, maybe my perspective on trees. And I think the best way to do that is really talking about a book that I wrote years ago. It's not my latest. I wrote 4 books, but it is the second. But if you have written books, you know, they're always like your children, right? You never really forget them. And you hold a very special place in your heart for them. So let me just share my screen because, as you can imagine, my talk is going to be very visual. And we can get started. So let me just open my screen here. And okay. Can you see my screen? I will take that as a yes. So I'm here really to talk about my second book, and I talk about my book not just necessarily, again, I'm not here to promote my book, but my book really goes extensively on this passion that I have for trees, not so much as real trees, and you're going to see that joke in a minute, but trees being used as metaphors for conveying human knowledge, right? A tree diagram or a tree illustration. But my book, in case you're interested, has been published, I would say 7 years ago, and it's called The Book of Trees, Visualizing Branches of Knowledge. It's, again, the joke is here. I always crack up when I see this review on Amazon. It's like, this book doesn't do anything for me. It's not about real trees of nature. So there you go. So it's not, my talk today is not about real trees, but metaphorical trees, right? In order for us to convey data, information, and overall human knowledge. So the book of trees and really the history of trees as diagrams for conveying information is a vast taxonomy. There's various different models and approaches to visualizing hierarchical knowledge, right? There's a long evolution of how trees have evolved through time. And this is really what I want to talk to you today, give you a little bit of perspective on this diversity of ways that exists out there on mapping hierarchies, and you always using the tree diagrams in a variety of different motifs and layouts. But you might ask yourself, why do a book on trees? That seems like an intriguing topic, especially not real trees again, metaphorical trees. Well, I think what really drove me to make this book, years ago, was really two things. One was I wanted to tell an untold story, and we're gonna go there in a moment. But I also wanted to oppose our present bias. So let's go. What do I mean by telling an untold story? I think it's a beautiful, beautiful story that somehow needed to be told. And from my research, there was really never at the time a book on trees as visual metaphors for human knowledge. So, and again, I'm not the only one. I'm sure many writers, many of you, many writers, journalists, designers are really intrigued by stories that have never been told before, right? So that's always a huge motivation to like do a bit more investigation and uncover some interesting nugget. And I first uncovered a story about the tree diagram when actually I was doing research on my very first book called Visual Complexity. Was published in August 2011. And visual complexity was my first love, my first book, my first children, right? And it is also a taxonomy. In this case, it's a visual taxonomy of network diagrams. In the book, I cover 15 distinct visualization models or topologies for mapping networks, which is really this visual alphabet that keeps on growing and expanding and morphing into a variety of shapes. But I'm always obsessed about the origin of things. I wanted to go further back, like who was the first person to think about depicting visually a network? Who was that first that spark of that first initial idea? And that took me back to Jacob Moreno, who is considered to be the father of social networks, not the Facebook and Instagrams of the world, but the real study on social networks, how human beings connect to each other, right, and exchanging information and relationships and so on. So what's interesting is that this is the very first visualization of a social network, right, on how human beings connect to each other in a fairly interrelated way. And this concept was so novel that when it was uncovered, the New York Times called it, they didn't know how to call it. They didn't have a name for it. Social networks was not a thing. This was almost, this was actually exactly 90 years ago. So a while back. So the New York Times called this diagram psychological geography, which I love, right? It's this idea of connecting somehow the human brain with notions of mapping, cartography, and geography. But I wanted to go even further back. I knew Jacob Moreno was kind of like the first one to think about representing visually how people are connected. But I wanted to go even further back. That took me to some of the earliest diagrams of a network. And this is considered to be a diagram that underlies the birth of network science as we know it by Leonhard Euler. It was just this complex sort of problem on how to crossing different bridges. And it was at the time represented as in this kind of like familiar network layout, which again, very, very innovative for the time. This is called the Seven Bridges of Königsberg. And again, that also made Euler not just a very famous mathematician, as many of you know, but also the father of network science. But I wanted to go even further back. And this is actually when I discovered trees. as the main predecessors of network diagrams. And the more ancient tree illustrations I discovered, the more obsessed I became, the more in love I became with some of these incredible medieval charts, illustrations, and graphics. So much so that the very first chapter of visual complexity that I just showed you was actually called The Tree of Life, believe it or not, as the origin of network visualizations. But I knew this story was, again, too large, too good to simply fit in a single chapter. And this is when, you know, I went through the effort of compiling, you know, this, my second book, the Book of Trees, Visualizing Branches of Knowledge, which really portrays this long evolution of, again, the tree metaphor in one single volume. So this is, you know, desire number one, telling in this untold story. Desire number two was really to, in many ways, oppose our present bias. And I think this is still a struggle that I face with most of my books. I think this is a motif, an argument, a rationale that keeps coming up in many of my work, which is curious, because I think it's so much needed. I think we live in a world where we think we are at the pinnacle of civilization. We think we are at the pinnacle of human development. And especially now with technology, right? We are so obsessed about the latest, the freshest news article or tweet or post. We keep on like swiping our phones for the very latest. The milliseconds matter, right? It's all about the present, the moment, right now. Everything that's like 5 minutes, let alone 5 years or 5 decades, it's already way in the past and not as interesting. And this is, of course, how we tend to perceive many human domains. This is also how information visualization is portrayed in many books, right? They normally portray this discipline as if a massive explosion that occurred in the past, you know, single decade or 2 decades. And some books, just for a little bit more of context, they might go back to the 18th, 19th century. But that's pretty much it, right? And as I point out in the book, given the recent surge of interest for the field, which Bob was alluding to in his intro, it's tempting to contemplate information visualization as an entirely new discipline, rising to meet the demands of the 21st century. But this couldn't be further from the truth. We need to really ask ourselves, what happened before the 19th and 18th century? Was it nothing but a blank slate? Of course not. There was a lot going on, believe me. And as Mike and Friendly puts so well, who has done a lot of research on the history of information design, there certainly have been many new things in the world of visualization. But unless you know its history, everything might seem novel. And for this, I always go back to the importance of having a broad look at history. Again, fighting this present bias we all carry within ourselves, to really understand the impact and the context of many things that surround us. One example that I love is this diagram from the Long Now Foundation. And the Long Now Foundation, they've really been pursuing this notion of literally elongating the present. So when we say now, we say maybe, you know, the last 3 days, today, yesterday, tomorrow. Nowadays might be the past, you know, roughly 30 years period. But they really want to create this notion of the long now, which is 20,000 years. Because some of the things that we see happening around us, they take that long to notice. And especially, and we could talk about this, like when it comes to like climate change and many of the things we are facing as a species, we need to add this like elongated notion of the present if you want to make meaningful changes into the future. So I wanted to tackle this because also when I look, and of course I'm a little bit of a history buff, and what I'm sometimes frustrated with history books is that most of them focus on either a specific topic or civilization, like Babylon or ancient Greece or the Maya civilization, or the Inca Empire. Or alternatively, they focus on a very specific period of time, such as the 12th century, or the 15th century, or the Age of Enlightenment, or the digital age. But I'm not actually very interested in those kinds of stories. I think they are very minuscule in ambition. I'm interested in much larger stories that really traverse time and space, right? This idea of a meta narrative, or like a narrative of narratives. And what I fell in love with the tree diagram is that it encompasses this narrative of narratives. As Wired Magazine put it when they were commenting on my book years ago, the tree diagram is a visual metaphor that's found across cultures throughout history. It's a data visualization tool that has outlived empires and endured huge upheavals in the arts and science. Right? Beautifully stated. So what is this story, you may ask? Let's dig into it. Let's dig into the history of the tree diagram. And for me to tell you this story, I'm going to take you back in time. I will take you exactly 800 years back in time to a really interesting period in medieval Europe, where there was a lot of movement happening in scholarly circles. First of all, there was an abundance of new knowledge coming to Europe, in part propagated throughout Europe by Muslim scholars. And this new knowledge was coming from the ancient world, ancient Greece and ancient Rome. There was also the time where we see the rise of university libraries for the first new centers of scholarly teaching and research, and for the first time completely independent from religion. This is also when we see the introduction of new Arabic numerals that facilitated organization and the reference of new material. In turn, this also caused different things to emerge. First of all, an increase in book production, also, of course, propelled by the invention of printing and cheaper paper. Also, a massive effort in classification and organization, right? All of a sudden, we didn't have just like 2 volumes, right, written by hand. That was like several hundred books. How do you make sense of it? How do you classify that volume of information? How do you make sense of it? How do you organize all of this new information? So that was a huge emphasis on classification back then. But on the topic of this talk, it also caused a renewed interest on visual communication. How do we diagrammatically represent information, sometimes replacing text altogether? So this is when we see a huge amount of exploration. We see people trying out all different types of diagrams and visual metaphors to convey a variety of things. These are just examples from Isidore Seville in Etymologies. This is also the age of the first large universal encyclopedias, right? Trying to encapsulate the whole of human knowledge. This one is one of the most intriguing ones, Etymologies, one of the oldest global encyclopedias. And here at the very center, you see the TO map. This was a very, very popular way of representing the known world back then, where Asia is at the top, Europe is on the bottom left, and Africa is on the bottom right. Many of these books are fascinating because of its value and relevance back then. This one, the Nuremberg Chronicle, is one of the best documented early incunabulum, right? The books printed before Gutenberg, before 1501. And this book in particular, it portrayed visually many European cities for the very first time. So can you imagine? This is like 1493. That was, centuries before photography was even a thing, was even invented. This was the very first time that many human beings, many citizens actually saw their cities represented in a visual way. So immensely, this book is fascinating. Taschen has actually made a reproduction, which I bought a few years back. And if you are curious, I'm sure it's still for sale. But we also see the work of Athanasius Kircher. I'm obsessed with Kircher because it was really embodying the embodiment of this fascination for visual metaphors. Kirchner at some point wanted to replace text altogether with diagrams. He thought that all of human knowledge can be represented in a visual diagrammatic way, which for any information designer is on its own a very bold statement and fascinating one, for sure. So out of all of these experiments, and we can see a variety of different shapes and layouts, the most popular of them was the tree. And you might ask, why trees, right? Of all these things that they were trying out, why was the tree diagram so popular back then? Well, it certainly will not be surprising to this audience, given the series that you are a part of, but not only did we came from trees, our ancestors came from trees, but also for thousands and thousands of years, trees have been vital to our survival, providing us with shelter, with food, with resources, weaponry, tools, you name it, right? It's hard to imagine such a time when we are, most of us at least, surrounded by glass, iron, and concrete. But for thousands and thousands of years, this has not been the case. Trees have been instrumental in our own survival. And I think we lost touch with that, unfortunately. And perhaps for that reason, trees also became important religious symbols across space and time. There's hardly one ancient religion that doesn't hold tree as something sacred and intrinsically part of their belief system. Many centuries before Christianity, ancient Babylon actually had the notion of a sacred tree that lived in paradise and was protected by a snake. This was also portrayed in Assyria and ancient Sumer. Ancient Egypt, as many of you know, they had several sacred trees, amongst them the papyrus grass plant. Of course, we also see the sacred tree in Judaism, in the famous Kabbalah tree, the tree of life. Christianity, of course, is filled with metaphorical uses of trees. There is, of course, as many of you might know, the tree of life and the tree of good and evil. Both trees are distinct and portrayed in the Bible at considerable lengths. And this is absolutely significant, the whole idea of, again, the snake, which is not completely new, as we saw. Ancient civilizations had the same concept, but it is absolutely central to the religious belief of Christians. We also see sacred tree, of course, in Buddhism, the famous Bodhi tree under which Siddhartha Gautama attained enlightenment is incredibly important. And even today, if you find yourself in many Asian countries, you might see fig trees completely decorated, which is a beautiful sight on its own, right? Because they still bear a lot of relevance to people in those places. We also, of course, see the sacred tree in Maya civilization. They had the Yashe tree of life, which was a tree that unified the three sacred worlds for Mayan: the underground, the real world, the terrestrial, and the celestial world. But at some point, trees became more than just religious or sacred symbols. They also became knowledge classification systems. They became important communication tools to illustrate a variety of systems of knowledge, right? And in part because they really illustrate these ideas of hierarchy, sometimes authority, balance, unity, and order, right? Which is absolutely paramount. And this is why we see over the centuries trees being used as visual metaphors to map things like morality. This is a fascinating topic. You see trees of virtues and trees of vices filling a variety of manuscripts in medieval Europe. And this is very ingenious. Like normally the tree of virtues is very exuberant, filled with fruits. And the tree of vices, as the example on the right portrays, it's kind of like dying in decay, right? So that it's really an illustration of the content it actually represents. You also see trees being used to map consanguinity, the blood ties between people. And at the time that the church imposed limitations on marrying close relatives, these maps were not just abstract representations. They were actually created as guidance for people to navigate themselves into the myriad of possible connections between family members, which is really, really interesting and funny if you think about it. We also, of course, see trees being used to map genealogy, right? This is perhaps the most obvious case that we all know. Many of you have your own family trees or have seen family trees like these that you see here, mapping the blood ties between people in different ways. We also see trees being used as metaphors to convey systems of law. And this might be, from my research, the oldest of all cases. There are testimonials, even though no representation has lasted through time, but there are testimonials that Roman lawyers actually used the tree as a diagram to convey the complexities of their systems of law. And which I'm fascinated by it, that again, lawyers of all people have been the engines behind information design, the genesis of information design today. So what I love also about the diagram that you see on the right side is that you see, of course, the diagram, but then you see all the letters, and then there's like a title on top of it. And it basically says that in Latin, since the matter of this topic is too intricate to explain and hard to explain, it might be easier to comprehend using the figurative art of a trunk and caption. So this is, again, in Latin, the designer explaining the intention behind doing this tree diagram in the first place, because it's going to be easier for someone to relate to, and they understand the inherent complexities of what it's trying to portray. We also, of course, see trees being used to map human knowledge. We owe a lot to Ramon Llull. I'm fascinated by Spanish scholar Ramon Llull, who we owe so much. And one of the things we owe him is the metaphor of human knowledge being organized as a tree. When we say biology is a branch of science, when we say genetics is a branch of science, right? Branches, this notion of a branch, part of a tree, we owe it to Ramon Llull. It was the first one, as we know it, to conceive science and human knowledge in the shape of a tree with its various different branches for the different topics and subtopics. We, of course, see trees being used for mapping in one of the oldest and largest encyclopedias. This is called, of course, the Encyclopédie by Diderot and D'Alembert. This was really the bastion of the French Enlightenment. It was accounting for 20 million words in 71,000 articles and 3,000 illustrations over 35 volumes. And in the beginning of this massive encyclopedia, again, the largest ever at the time, we have this incredible tree diagram that worked not just as a table of contents, right? But it also expressed how all of these, because you could actually reference the different topics in the encyclopedia, but also it worked as an incredible way of illustrating all the interconnections between human knowledge. We also, of course, see trees being used to map the relationship between species, right? Charles Darwin, the very single illustration in The Origin of Species that Darwin did was this one on the right side. It was the only illustration in the entire book. And there's a letter from Darwin to the publisher saying how critical it was for him to include this diagram in the book, because it was absolutely central to his theory on evolution. And of course, the diagram is called the Tree of Life. As a fan of Darwin, Ernst Haeckel was also obsessed with trees, and he used a variety of different fascinating tree diagrams, like you see here, to map all different types of relationships between species. Moving closer to us, we also see alternative uses for the tree diagram. In this one, it's called the petroleum tree from 1957. Really like mapping all the derivatives of gas oil, right, in this petroleum tree. This is the first computer tree as we know it, and we see like the evolution of computer programming languages. We see like ENIAC there in 1946, and then we see the different branches and sub-branches that have emerged since then. This was made by the US military, right? And it was a fascinating sort of diagram to express the evolution of computing. And this one, I think this one back then, but the book was actually published in 2014 or 13. And this is one of the latest that I have in this category. It's a tree of connections between a series of popular blogs. And there's different leaves, the different colors for categories. There's different fruits, apples, as you can see there. But what I'm really interested in is how these fascinating tree diagrams have been with us for so long, right? In chapter 1 alone on figurative trees, I covered 800 years of history, right? And the image on the left and the image on the right is separated by 800 years. So every chapter, by the way, is organized chronologically in order to portray the large evolution of the tree diagrams according to each model. And on the left side, you have the main characters in the Bible. And on the right side, you have the popular blogs of 2012. You couldn't probably find more disparate topics, yet using very similar metaphors. But what's interesting about the book, in my view, is that it doesn't really focus only on figurative trees, because first of all, they are obvious and we have seen those for many, many years. But what's interesting for me, especially as a researcher on this topic, is, and we don't know exactly when, but at some point, someone must have realized that the hierarchical logic of a tree can be conveyed without many of its natural embellishments, without the leaves, the branches, and the shrubberies. And that opened the door to a huge revolution, a huge graphical revolution. It might be almost similar to like a Cambrian explosion, if you want to take a biological comparison. And this created a more stylized, abstract construct called the node link diagram, right? And many of the chapters in the book focus on these more abstract layouts for the tree, right, as a diagram. And even though some of them are still fairly old, we see this being used still continuously in modern times. You know, vertical trees were probably the direct successor of figurative trees. And this is actually not a real tree as we know it. This is called the inverted tree in the sense that the root is normally at the top. And this is by the way, not by accident. People unroll the scroll, and as they unroll the scroll, it was more convenient for the root of that tree to be at the very top. And as you unroll the scroll and the long parchment, the root of origin was always at the first element to be disclosed. And as you unroll it, you would see the different generations that unfold. In my research, I found this diagram, which I think is really interesting. It's, you know, again, in biology, this would be called a transitional fossil, right? it's a species in between species, right? It's almost here as the designer is still attached to the past, doing a lot of a few shrubberies and traditional branches of a real tree, but also using more abstract and diagrammatic sort of circles that are, so it's kind of like in between, right? This kind of like transition of fossil, of graphical representation. And of course, I cannot avoid showing this comparison, like how our interests have changed over time. On the left side is genealogy of Christ from 1205. And on the right side, you have the X-Men family tree from 2011. There are beautiful trees. I mean, I could talk about some of these examples for forever, really. This one is actually an horizontal tree. It's basically like a vertical tree, but following an horizontal axis. This is a beautiful, beautiful illustration. It's in the Book of Flowers, Liber Floridas, by Lamarck de Saint-Omer. This is almost 1,000 years old, and it's the tree of vices and the tree of virtue, right? Again, it's facing side by side. A few other horizontal trees that the book also portrayed not just vertical and horizontal trees, but also multi-directional trees. So multi-directional trees are just a little bit looser and more free-form layout. Again, not specifically following a vertical or strict horizontal axis. It's more organic, right? It feels almost like hand drawn as a system, as a layout, which is a fascinating exploration. But still, again, very much mapping hierarchy. Circles, of course, and I also wrote a book about circles, so I could talk about circles for quite some time. But circles carry a huge significance to many cultures around the world, and soon, of course, the tree diagram and a circle had to be combined, and this created radial trees. So this is very much the same in logic as a traditional tree. In this case, the root is at the core, at the center of the tree. In this case, it's actually as the CEO, the president of an organization. And then the various layers of dependency are moving in rings towards the periphery, right? The successive generations and sub branches of that tree, all the way to the individual workman at the bottom. And then you have this notion of hyperbolic trees. These are the first such trees have emerged really recently with the advent of digital computing. And because they are pretty advanced algorithms, they are very similar. Imagine if there was like a sphere, right? And you were mapping a circular tree, a radial tree on top of a sphere, and there's a natural distortion. So some areas look a bit magnified and giving you emphasis on where you should be looking at, and other areas are just, again, really tiny, so that you're not really paying attention to everything all at once, which is really important for interacting with really large, complex tree structures. Now, we looked at this Cambrian explosion, right? When the tree lost its natural embellishments, it really opened the door for a variety of new models to emerge. The second major revolution occurred in the early 1990s through the work of Ben Schneiderman, who was actually trying to visualize his hard drive using a nested mechanism called the tree map. Now, the idea of a tree map, and maybe people oppose to this, well, a tree map is not really a tree, but, maybe not a node-link diagram is not a real tree, right? And here, the notion of a tree is that it's mapping a hierarchical structure. So in this case, the root is the outer shape, in this case, a square, because this is a rectangular tree map. And you keep subdividing the shape into different generations, right? You divide once, you divide 3 times, 4, and successfully different times. So this is actually the very first rectangular tree map created by Schneiderman in 1991. Again, the outer shape is the entire hard drive of Ben Schneiderman back then. And you keep on subdividing, right? Each box into sub branches. And why did it try this model? Because apparently, as far as we know, it tried a variety of node link diagrams like the ones we saw before, but it was simply too complex. And these tree maps they are fascinating because now you cannot just convey, again, from an information design capability, not only are you able to convey the hierarchy of that structure, but you also have volume or area, and you actually can associate area to different things like volume, financial gain, number of employees, like whatever data variable you might have. And this space filling diagrams that use this nested mechanism to imply hierarchy, they also open the door again to another Cambrian explosion. There was a variety over the past 20 years or so, a variety of new models being created. This is still a rectangular tree map, this one used for a visualization of news articles indexed by Google, where color represents categories and the area, the size of each box represents the number of articles on that topic. So it gives you a sense of popularity. And then there's a variety of experiments. These are called Voronoi tree maps, various polygonal shapes. They tend to be beautiful. They kind of resemble stained glass. There were also experiments on the notion of a circular tree map. This is by K. Wetzel, called Pebbles. The idea is the same. The outer circle is the root, and you keep subdividing the circle into smaller and smaller and smaller parts or sub-branches. This has been used to map a directory of computer files. This is also called a sunburst or a nested pie chart. It's just, I guess, the same idea, right? At the core, you have your root, and you keep subdividing each ring into smaller and smaller parts. And finally, our last species, it's called the icicle trees. In this case, it's actually a music folder where you have playlist, artist, album, and song, all the way to individual song, visualized in this hierarchy called an icicle tree. So these are many of the hundreds of images exposed in the book, right? And it is quite a treasure trove of maps, illustrations, and graphics of all types. And because I still might have a few more minutes, I want to tell you just a little bit about the behind the scenes. Many people ask me about, what does it take to do a book like this, a book on circles, or the one that I did, a book on trees, or the one I did on circles, where you get to do so much historical research and also collecting so many images. So I'm going to take you a little bit behind the scenes on how a book like this comes into place and is created. So doing research on old material is never easy, especially for like an amateur like myself. But fortunately, many museums, libraries, and institutions are making their vast body of work available online. It's still easy for me as a researcher sitting in a cafe in Brooklyn, New York, to be looking at a manuscript in the university of somewhere in Germany, right? So that advantage is absolutely key. And I look back and I think if I was to put together some of the books that I did, maybe 30 years ago, it would have been completely different. I would have to spend maybe 10 years actually going into physical locations, asking to see manuscript A, B, and C. So I cannot even imagine the amount of work. So fortunately, it's becoming easier and easier to do work on this topic as many institutions are making it available online. But part of this research is also knowing how to type tree in every possible language imaginable. That's what I did. I had to learn how do you write tree in every single language. So, but most importantly, in Latin, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, German, it helps a lot because that's where you uncover some of the nuggets in those ancient manuscripts. But sometimes when you finally find a really compelling illustration, there's not a lot of information about it, right? Sometimes just the year. So if you're lucky, the author's name. And this is really when the real fun begins, trying to find out as much as you can about the author, her life or his life, the work, etc., etc. And of course, for that, you have things like Wikipedia, Google Books, the Internet Archive, and a variety of different museums, galleries, and encyclopedias online. Other times, you are invited for a birthday party, and true story, at the Rubin Museum of Art in New York, only to realize that, my God, they have this like incredible number of like paintings on Tibetan Buddhism that uses hundreds of T diagrams. They are called refuge trees, right? Normally showing various gurus and lamas in the tree. And you want to include 20 of those images in the book. But then, of course, you realize they are immensely expensive and you can only include 2, as I did in the book. The work also means that you have to spend sometimes a lot of time just managing emails, like hundreds and hundreds of emails, getting approval on imagery and assets, color coding, etc. I actually use Adobe Bridge, which is a fascinating tool organizing and categorizing all images, metadata, different color coding, etc. And then, of course, many revisions for the text on grammar, sourcing, annotations. It's not 1, it's not 2, it's just multiple revisions, which is quite exhausting. Finally, to get to the fun part, the book cover. As a designer, this is, of course, also my favorite part, but the ultimate say when it comes to a cover is always on the publisher. So it's a little bit of a tense dialogue at times, but a fascinating one. And so these are some of the explorations, in this case for my book of trees, before you actually get to this, the very last physical, tangible book in your hands. So this is pretty much the end of my talk. There's also, of course, mentions if you are interested. What I love about some of my past books is that they don't, again, focus on one specific area of knowledge. And I think you can see that by the range of reviews that they get from publications like Wired or New Scientist, Fast Company, right, the Boston Globe. Like, it's just a variety of different sort of like angles and approaches on such a broad topic. So thank you so much. This was an absolute pleasure to talk to you a little bit about trees as metaphors for conveying human knowledge. And I hope there's questions now, which I would love to answer. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Hi, Manuel. Thank you for that. That's fascinating. It's nice to hear that again. I own the copy of the book, which I highly recommend people get. It's not only beautifully designed, but it's just a great journey back through history. Um, and it's really nice to hear you explain all this again. It's also, I'm going to be really honest here. It's
Huh.
nice to see somebody make a presentation that's been done by a designer. It's beautifully organized, it's clear. Thank you for that. So we do have a couple of really nice questions, interesting questions. The one that jumps out at me is, I hope I say his name right. I know it's the Swedish botanist Carolus Linnaeus, who did the hierarchy of
Oh, yeah.
categorizing nature. Did you ever, because his categorization was so radical at the time and was layered, it had a hierarchy. Did you get any indication that a tree might have been an inspiration for how that grew? Pardon the pun.
Well, I'm sure it was. I've actually seen representations of that system, not necessarily like a figurative tree, but more like a table, which resembles kind of like this rectangular tree map shape. but I'm sure it was. This was a time where the tree diagram was very much, again, used to, again, even like going back to Raman Lul, human knowledge, this idea of human knowledge or species has been used for quite some time as a metaphor for organizing and making sense and classifying, right?
Yeah.
All of this knowledge. So I'm sure it was.
Another question here, which is near and dear to me as well. I think in the history of our design firm, clearly in the history of our design firm, the image of a tree as used for branding purposes was probably the most popular icon. People just, and you touched upon it initially, people love what a tree symbolizes. Um, can you talk a little bit more about that, the image of a tree, and what is it about the image itself, or maybe the contents within it, that help everything from banks to mutual funds to schools use this image, and, uh, and that's not recently. That goes back for years and years and years.
It's hard to say. I mean, trees are certainly a universal symbol, right? Well, first of all, they are a universal symbol, and as universal symbol that it is, we don't have that many, right? Even with emoticons, as we know, like some of them don't really translate across cultures, right? So we only have a handful of like really like truly universal symbols that you can look and understand what it means, and that's the power that they have over the human psyche across space and time, right? And yeah, I mean, of course, some brands might use it as a form of greenwashing or just, evocating some sort of like concern over the environment, even if there's not a lot there, as a form of branding and marketing. And even going back to branding and marketing, we know how to play with the human mind, and using universal symbols like a tree has always been very fruitful. But I think it goes back to that. There's something deep in our human psyche that associates trees. The same thing with circles, by the way, during my research, associates trees with some sort of like safety and a refuge, right? For us, either to climb and avoid a predator, either to provide with things like food or shelter. Images like, which has been proved, like the image of a savanna, of like having a green field with like a river flowing and a blue sky. Those are also universal types of imagery that really calms down a lot of our anxiety tendencies, right? And because we associate them with safety and perhaps some sort of safe harbor in many cases. So I think that's deep in our psyche, and of course, marketing and branding would be foolish not to leverage that capability.
Yeah, and it also makes me think that not only has branding capitalized on the image of the tree itself, it's looked at some of the components of a tree, like an acorn is such a great image for growth into an oak tree, which is the strongest tree. Leaves, and the tree itself is a fractal when you think of the branching into the smaller branches, even into the branching within leaves itself.
Absolutely. I mean, you go back to also ideas of like things like order, right? Things like balance, like unity. If you as a brand, if you have that as part of your mission, of course, tree is such a powerful symbol for representing those concepts, right? So of course, you get foolish not to leverage it, because that's what normally we associate trees with. And the same thing with circles, by the way. There's so many overlap. It's kind of funny. Circles as well. I mean, there's almost, it's hard to find like a brand book that doesn't have countless logos with circles in it, because it's this idea of union, right? Of belonging, the sense of connection, the sense of like a whole, right? And those are really powerful concepts that are expressed in such simple ways, because I think that's really the trick that a lot of communication designers are striving when they create a brand, is like, how can we convey fairly complex topics like safety or belonging or unity in the minimum amount of ink, right? So
Yeah.
going to universal metaphors like circles and trees are always a recipe for success.
And as a side note, it makes me think about I'm also fascinated by the Fibonacci sequence, which is essentially it's a growth pattern, the
Mhm.
double helixes that go out. And it's here in Canada, it's a symbol that's been adopted by the Green Party because it is so directly associated with nature.
Mm.
Uh, but conversely, it's the foundation for BP, British Petroleum Oil's logo,
Ah,
which I
yeah.
love the logo, but I go, wow, I'm not sure that that is the best corporate message that a Fibonacci uh, diagram rooted in nature to be associated with an oil company. So sometimes you see these images misappropriated.
Well, I think all of us are used to like those cultural incongruences, right? Like of seeing how an oil company is represented by the patterns of a flower. I mean, you couldn't find like a more dystopian sort of like, but somehow it makes sense, and or at least we got used to that somehow.
Which leads us back to the fact that it is such a universal symbol, universally recognized across countries, cultures, that you can see why it's a fallback, fail-safe
Mm,
imagery because it just resonates with us on so many different levels. Could
yeah.
you tell us a bit more? So, out of your book of visualization, you explain that the tree surfaces of, and you could have gone on chapter, and then you go, well, that's a book. I am assuming within that book there's a chapter about circles, and of course, you make a book on circles. Have you have there been other icons that have surfaced in your research that may not justify an entire book, maybe a chapter, but other icons, images that you've seen that have a nice little lifespan to them?
Mhm. That's a great point. Well, yeah, joking aside, many friends have asked me, what's next after you do a book of circles, a book of rectangles or triangles? Like, but I don't think they are quite appealing. I was at this conference filled with philosophers at a philosophy school at some point in the past. And I got to speak to a philosopher whose research is entirely on imagery, which is a fascinating topic. The imagery and how it's used in philosophy over the years. And it seems like these three are the most both universal and most recurring metaphors. The circle, the most ancient one is the circle, right? That's why I went back further to your point. Why doing a book of circles? Because I wanted to go even further back to the most original sort of symbolic representation of human knowledge, and that was a circle. It goes back 40,000 years ago. I mean, of course, the meaning got lost at some point, but we can see some of these thing like concentric rings, which is used for like London Underground, the Who, like bands, Heart. They are very hypnotic. They are used back 40,000 years ago. Concentric rings. You also have the spiral, and you have the cross and sector. So it's a circle with a cross between. That's called the sun symbol. It's multiple civilizations have had a meaning to it, but these are the most ancient sort of like manifestations of the circle. So I think those circle, tree, and the network are the three more interesting metaphors for me. Now, of course, in my research, I've uncovered a lot of things on triangles, for example, in the whole idea of a triad, of combination, religion, Christianity uses the whole idea of triangles a lot to, to explain the whole idea of the Trinidad, the Trinity in Christianity is a very popular theme. But some of these other visual metaphors are just not as appealing, or at least there's not a lot of interesting examples to make certainly into a book, maybe a chapter. To your point, maybe there is certainly material
Yeah.
for like a chapter, but I don't think there's, at least for me, enough material to make sense to do a whole book on one of those.
We have a number of questions around love research presenters who have
Bob, can you hear me?
Hi, Manuel. It sounds like Bob's frozen for a bit, so I'll ask
Oh,
a few
okay.
questions until he gets back online.
No worries, no worries.
Here's one that came in. How important do you think the concept of continuity is when it comes to selecting a tree as an image, as an icon or whatever? It would seem to resonate deeply with the human psyche because branching out is how we literally evolved. And then I'll disappear
so-
again. It's Bob's back.
Absolutely. I think I keep mentioning, hierarchy and it's almost like synonymous with tree as a diagram. But yeah, continuity or forking is another super important idea that the tree represents so well, right? And it's not just trees, even you look at rivers, from above, this idea that you have a larger portion of something that keeps on subdividing into smaller and smaller parts. So again, our ancestors didn't have the ability to like ride an airplane and see that this pattern exists in other places of nature. But trees, not just trees, but also like small shrubberies have the same sort of pattern of continuity. So yes, absolutely, continuity is a super important aspect of why the tree diagram became such a popular choice to represent those types of topics.
Manuel, I'm back. I got frozen there. Did you hear my question about research?
No,
Okay.
I lost you in the beginning.
Okay, there's a lot of people in the NLC world audience who are avid researchers, and they particularly appreciate people like yourself who do extensive research. There's several questions here about the research, but what's surfacing is, although you did a lot of this research online, were you able to do any of this in person at museums or libraries?
I did a few. But it's again so time consuming that I mean, again, it's becoming so easy for us to look and not just find some of these things online, but just the ability to search within the volumes, like search digitally, search for things. It just makes I can look at 10 manuscripts like much faster than I can look at one in
Right.
person. So it's not just the easiness of it, it's also the speed that allows me to search. Because I'm looking for nuggets, and I need to see as many as I can. And I didn't have a team, it was just me. So I need to be quick. Finding to
Well, then
speed.
on that note, if you could, of all these beautiful images of trees that go way back, if there's one that you could see in person that you didn't,
Ooh.
would there be one or several that jump out that you go, boy, that just is spectacular. I'd love to see it.
Oh my God, yes. That image of like the two trees, one living on each page. It's my all-time favorite. It's by the Book of Flowers by Lambert Saint-Mer, and it's just a fascinating image. I think it's the only one that actually occupies 2 pages in my book as well. I try to almost like not an entire replica because you still have other elements in the page that you need to put, but it's taking 2 entire pages, so it's like a full spread. And yes, I would love to see that in person, also because apparently, from what I could read, it's fairly large. So I would love to just see it with all the detail and magic of looking at that in person for sure.
Well, I hope you get that opportunity. And maybe as a last question, and it's a little broad, could you, you're an expert on visualization, the bigger picture. Are there any trends that you're seeing? And as I mentioned earlier, and you confirmed it, this world of information um, is so ever changing, where information junkies, our attention span due to the social media and the iPhone is shrinking and shrinking. So visual communication and visual data is growing. Are there any trends that you're seeing happening at the moment? Trends that you think will continue to grow or will be short-lived?
I mean, I will tell you about a trend that I would like for it to be reversed. And yes, to your point, I think you're right. We are in many ways inundated with information, with data, and it seems like visual communication, it can be a little bit of of a counter approach to this excess of information, at least in text form. But we also are becoming numb to many of the graphs and charts that we see. I mean, take a variety of like human tragedies that we just have to turn on the news. What do we do as a community? We just create more charts and graphics and line charts and pie charts of all types, mapping this as if we are talking about not real people. Because from the moment you actually plot a human being as a dot, as a bubble, immediately becomes an abstraction. And what I feel, and I talked this a little bit about actually in my latest book on the ethics of design, is that by doing so, we are removing ourselves from the real problem. You know, the human suffering, amongst many other issues, are just another chart. And there's this notion of a chart overload, and you become numb to charts and charts and charts. And you forget what the chart is actually representing, because beyond that chart, there's a lot of people that are actually dying and suffering and in pain. And that abstraction becomes just a form of moral disengagement, of moral detachment.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you, Manuel. This has been wonderful. It certainly satisfied my curiosity, and I'm glad you were able to make the time to do this. So I'm going to pass it over to Elizabeth to officially sign off. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Bob. It was great to have you. Yeah, it's great to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks, both of you. Manuel, that was a fascinating presentation. And Bob, your particular insights helped us appreciate even more subject matter, which was, as I said, a fantastic way to end our Power of Trees journey, which has been one of branching out and learning and connecting, which is what we do at NLC. So thank you again, Manuel. And just to let our audience know that over the next few months, we'll be busy planning the spring 2024 program, which is about migration. We don't have a firm title yet, but the content will be about the movement of people, plants, animals, and ideas and how they change the world. So watch your email for updates from NLC, and please complete the survey on your way out the door. Thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you watching the recording, we know you will enjoy it, and have a lovely weekend. Goodbye.
See you, Bob.